Peter Parker blows his secret identity. The Raimi Spider-Man origin story is iconic, but one of its biggest plot holes shows up almost immediately after Peter gets his powers. The cafeteria scene is played for comedy, yet when you really break it down, Peter might as well be wearing a name tag that says future superhero. He catches an entire lunch tray mid-air with inhuman reflexes, fires weapon instinctively, and humiliates Flash Thompson with sudden martial arts skills. This isn't subtle. This isn't, oh wow, he got lucky. This is a public crowded space full of teenagers who see the same kid every single day suddenly move like a trained assassin with Spider-Man level reflexes. What makes it worse is the timing. This all happens just days before Spider-Man publicly debuts in New York City. From a narrative logic standpoint, that's insanely suspicious. A scrawny science nerd with zero athletic background suddenly develops superhuman coordination, strength, and combat instincts. And then a masked hero with those exact traits appears shortly after. At least one student should have connected the dots. Even if they didn't jump straight to Peter as Spider-Man, rumors should have exploded. Instead, the movie treats the moment like it vanished into thin air. Another issue is how loud and theatrical Peter's powers. We are not talking about dodging or suddenly moving faster. He webs foods, launches Flash across the cafeteria, and leaves a web tray dangling behind him like a calling card. High school students gossip, speculate, exaggerate, and cling to weird details forever. The idea that no one thought, hey, remember when Parker started doing impossible things right before Spider-Man showed up, stretches believability, even by superhero movie standards. You could argue that people didn't understand what they were seeing, but that excuse only goes so far, and Flash himself would absolutely never let this go. All that being said, this plot hole doesn't ruin the movie, but it does highlight how superhero origin stories often rely on selective memory from side characters. The film needs Peter to say anonymous, so the world simply agrees to ignore the most obvious red flags. It's a small but glaring flaw in an otherwise classic film, and once you notice it, it's impossible to unsee. Cyclops' inconsistent age. One of the quiet but most persistent plot holes in the X-Men films revolves around Scott Summers, better known as Cyclops. When he first appears in X-Men, he is clearly an adult, confident, battle-tested, and positioned as one of Charles Xavier's earliest and most trusted students. Played by James Marsden, Cyclops feels like he's in his early 30s, already carrying the weight of leadership and responsibility. The movie treats him as someone who's been part of the X-Men for a long time, which makes sense, until the prequels start rewriting history. The confusion begins with X-Men First Class, set in the 1960s, and marketed as the origin of the X-Men. This movie shows Xavier forming his very first team, yet Cyclops is nowhere to be found. Instead, we meet his older brother, Havoc. If Scott is Xavier's first student in the original films, where was he during the formation of the team? Was he too young? Not recruited yet? The movie never explains it, leaving a massive gap in Cyclops' supposed history. Things get messier in X-Men Origins Wolverine, set mainly in the 1970s. Here Cyclops appears as a teenager, being experimented on by Weapon X. This portrayal directly clashes with the idea that he was already an established X-Men by the time of the original trilogy. If Scott is a teenager in the 70s, then by the year 2000, he should be in his late 40s or early 50s, not the age he clearly appears to be. At this point, the timeline is already bending in ways that don't add up. Then X-Men Apocalypse pours gasoline on the fire. Set in the 1980s, it introduces Cyclops again, this time as a high school student in his late teens. That version of Scott feels even younger than the one in Origins Wolverine, despite the film being set later. Now Cyclops has somehow gone from a teen in the 70s to a teen again in the 80s. Unless time travel erased his aging process, which the movie never suggests, this version of the character simply cannot coexist with the others. By the end of it all, Cyclops' age becoming impossible to pin down without doing mental gymnastics, the franchise wanted the freedom to reboot characters without committing to a consistent timeline, and Scott Summers paid the price. Instead of feeling like a foundational X-Men whose growth we follow, Cyclops becomes a floating piece in time, rewritten whenever the plot needs him younger or older. Electro knowing Spider-Man's identity. One of the clever narrative rules that No Way Home sets up early on is simple and clean. Only villains who know Spider-Man's true identity are pulled into the MCU from across the multiverse. That rule works perfectly for characters like Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and even Sandman, all of whom explicitly learn that Peter Parker is Spider-Man in their original films. It's a smart way to limit the chaos and keeps the story focused. But then Electro shows up and suddenly that rule starts to fall apart. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Electro never learns Peter Parker's identity. Not even close. Max Dillon knows Spider-Man Spider-Man as a masked figure who ignored him, embarrassed him, and eventually fought him. Their relationship is entirely public-facing. There's no unmasking, no whispered revelation, no dramatic Peter Parker moment. In fact, Electro barely understands himself, let alone who's under Spider-Man's mask. So when Electro claims in No Way Home that he was absorbing data and suddenly ended up in another universe, it raises a huge red flag. The movie tries to handwave this with a vague explanation. Electro was connected to electricity, data, and energy grids, so maybe he learned Spider-Man's identity digitally right before dying. The problem is that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 never even hints at this. There's no scene of Electro hacking Oscorp files, no implication that Peter's identity is stored somewhere accessible, and no suggestion that Spider-Man's identity was public knowledge in that universe. This turns what should have been a clean multiversal rule into a retroactive patch job. And what makes this plot hole more noticeable is how strict the rule is for everyone else. Lizard qualifies because he knows Peter is Spider-Man, Sandman qualifies because he learns it at the end of Spider-Man 3, Doc Ock qualifies because Peter unmasks himself in their final battle, Electro is the only exception, and exceptions without explanation weaken stakes. If Marvel can bend its own rules whenever it wants, then the entire multiversal premise starts to feel less deliberate and more convenient. Out of universe, the reason is obvious. Jamie Foxx's Electro was popular, visually distinct, and fans wanted him back, especially a redesigned, improved version. And to be fair, he is fun in No Way Home. But story-wise, his inclusion clearly prioritized spectacle over internal logic. Marvel wanted the sinister style lineup, and the Electro fit the vibe, even if he didn't fit the rules. In the end, this plot hole doesn't ruin Spider-Man No Way Home, but it does stand out because the movie is otherwise so tightly written. When a film goes out of its way to establish clear rules, breaking them for one character feels sloppy rather than clever. How Pym Particles work. When Ant-Man first introduces Pym Particles, it does something the MCU doesn't always do. It clearly explains the rules. Hank Pym tells Scott Lang that shrinking doesn't reduce mass, it compresses the distance between atoms, and that explanation is crucial, because it justifies why Ant-Man can punch with the force of a full-grown man while being insect-sized. The problem is that the movie immediately and repeatedly ignores those rules whenever they become inconvenient. The biggest contradiction shows up almost instantly: ants. If Scott retains full human mass while shrunk, then riding on the back of an ant should be impossible. He would weigh hundreds of pounds relative to the insect, instantly crushing it. Instead, ants carry him, leap across surfaces with him, clinging onto him, and behave as if he weighs practically nothing. This directly contradicts Hank Pym's own explanation and turns what should be a serious physical limitation into a visual gag the movie never addresses. The issue gets even worse when the film starts treating shrunken objects like toys. Scott casually carries a shrunken tank, tosses it into a briefcase, and later expands it mid-fight with no concern for momentum, force, or mass displacement. What makes this plot hole especially frustrating is that Ant-Man didn't need to explain Pym Particles at all. The MCU often handwaves science, and audiences are usually fine with it. But once Hank Pym explicitly lays out the mass doesn't change rule, the story becomes accountable to it. Every scene that contradicts it feels less like creative freedom and more like inconsistency. The movie wants both realism and cartoon logic, and it keeps switching between the two mid-scene. Later MCU appearances only make the problem worse. In Civil War and Endgame, Ant-Man grows and shrinks with no consistent impact on surroundings, physics, or collateral damage. Sometimes he hits like a freight train, other times he's light enough to surf debris. The rules bend based on what looks coolest in the moment, and Pym Particles become less of a scientific breakthrough and more of a narrative cheat code. Yes, this plot hole doesn't break Ant-Man as a movie or Ant-Man as a character, but it does expose a recurring MCU habit, explaining just enough science to sound smart, then ignoring it when it complicates the action. The US Army wanted to waste Captain America's abilities. One of the most powerful moments in the first Avenger is Steve Rogers' transformation. This scrawny kid from Brooklyn steps out of the Vita Ray chamber as a physical marvel, immediately proving the serum works by chasing a Hydra agent through city streets, leaping impossible distances, smashing through obstacles, and showing instincts that go far beyond brute strength. In just a few minutes, Steve demonstrates that he isn't just strong, he's fast, adaptive, and tactically sharp. From a military standpoint, this should have set off every alarm bell imaginable in the best possible way. And yet, almost immediately the US Army makes a baffling decision. Instead of treating Steve as the single most valuable military asset they've ever created, they turn him into a propaganda mascot. He's dressed in a cheap costume, shoved onto a stage, and sent around the country to sing, dance, and sell war bonds. This isn't just a misuse of Steve Rogers. It is a waste of the only successful super soldier the program ever produced. Literally any actor, athlete, or soldier could have filled the PR role. Steve is irreplaceable, and they park him under stage flights. What makes this even stranger is that the army doesn't even seem interested in studying him properly. Dr. Erskine is dead, the formula is lost, and Steve Rogers is the only living proof that the serum works. Yet there's no intense testing, no attempts to reverse engineer the process, no long-term observation program. From a logical standpoint, Steve should have been under constant supervision, with scientists documenting every physiological and psychological change. Instead, the military just shrugs and lets the greatest breakthrough in human enhancement history tour the country with a chorus line. The decision also ignores the context of the war itself. Hydra isn't a rumor. They are actively deploying advanced weapons, energy tech, and enhanced soldiers. Even if the army didn't trust Steve enough for frontline combat yet, keeping him benched makes no sense when the enemy is escalating so rapidly. At the very least, he could have been used for elite operations, intelligence missions, or as a deterrent. Ultimately, the movie frames this choice as the army misunderstanding Steve's value, and thematically that works. It reinforces the idea that institutions fail to recognize true heroism until it forces their hand. But from an in-universe logic perspective, it's still hard to swallow. The US Army didn't just underuse Captain America. They actively squandered the most important military breakthrough of the 20th century. Thanos never should have given Loki the Mind Stone. One of the biggest MCU plot holes only becomes obvious in hindsight, once the Infinity Saga is fully laid out. In the Avengers, Loki arrives on Earth wielding a mysterious scepter that grants mind control, enhanced power, and the ability to bend others to his will. At the time, it's framed as just another cosmic artifact given to him by a shadowy benefactor. Years later, that scepter is revealed to house the Mind Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones that Thanos would eventually risk everything to collect. And that's where the logic completely falls apart. By the time Infinity War rolls around, it's made crystal clear that Thanos treats the Infinity Stones as sacred, irreplaceable tools. He personally hunts them down, slaughters civilizations for them, and even sacrifices his own daughter to obtain one. Given that mindset, the idea that he would casually hand one of the stones to Loki, a known wildcard with his own ambitions, feels widely out of character. This isn't a trusted lieutenant or a loyal general. Loki is reckless, emotional, and famously unreliable. Giving him the Mind Stone is like handing a nuclear warhead to someone you already know will betray you. Thanos didn't need to give Loki an Infinity Stone to invade Earth. The Chitauri army, the portal check, and Loki's own sorcery were already more than enough to kick off a planetary assault. The Mind Stone was an overcommitment, and sure enough, that gamble immediately backfires. Loki loses, the Avengers capture the scepter, and the Mind Stone vanishes into Earth's custody for years, eventually becoming Vision. From a strategic standpoint, Thanos didn't just lose a battle, he misplaced 1/6 of ultimate power. There's also no solid, in-universe explanation that truly justifies this decision. Some fans argue that Thanos was testing Loki, or that he didn't fully understand the stones yet, but later films contradict that idea by showing Thanos has always been aware of their importance and lethality. In reality, this feels less like a character choice and more like early MCU growing pains. When the Avengers was written, the Infinity Stones hadn't yet been fully mapped out as the saga's backbone. The scepter was just a cool villain weapon, retroactively upgraded into something far more important. Nick Fury knew about aliens long before Thor. Nick Fury has always been framed as the ultimate long game planner of the MCU, so when a contradiction pops up around him, it really stands out. Back in the Avengers, Fury explains that S.H.I.E.L.'s push toward advanced weapons and Tesseract research came after humanity learned it wasn't alone in the universe. He specifically points to the arrival of the Asgardians in Thor as the wake-up call. It's a clean, logical motivation, until Captain Marvel rewrites the timeline. In Captain Marvel, we meet a much younger Nick Fury in 1995, and within days, his entire worldview explodes. He encounters Carol Danvers, watches her fly through space, and learns about an intergalactic war between the Kree and the Skrulls. He doesn't just hear about aliens, he works with them, fights them, and helps stop an alien invasion on Earth. By the end of the movie, Fury is fully aware that space empires exist, Earth is being watched, and humanity is unprepared. That's not a small revelation, that's a full-on paradigm shift. And that's where the plot hole kicks in hard. If Fury already knew about alien civilizations, advanced space travel, and planet-destroying tech in 1995, then why does he later frame the Asgardians as the reason S.H.I.E.L.D. escalated its weapons programs? Thor arriving in New Mexico should have been shocking, sure, but not defining. Compared to the Kree, Skrulls, and the cosmic scale Fury already witnessed, Asgardians should have been just another box check on a very long list of extraterrestrial threats. You can try to patch it up with headcanon explanations. Maybe Fury meant Thor was the first public proof of aliens, not the first time he personally knew about them. Maybe S.H.I.E.L.D. buried the events of Captain Marvel so deeply that Fury couldn't openly justify policy decisions with classified alien encounters. Or maybe he was lying, selectively shaping the Avengers' understanding of events else to control the narrative. Those explanations can soften the blow, but none of them fully fix the contradiction, especially since Fury speaks in the Avengers as if the Asgardians generally changed everything. Mystique's death causes a major paradox. By the time Dark Phoenix rolled around, the X-Men franchise's timeline was already hanging by a thread. Years of prequels, soft reboots, and time travel had turned what started as a fairly straightforward trilogy into a narrative maze. Still, Dark Phoenix managed to introduce one of the most confusing contradictions of all, the death of Mystique. It's meant to be a shocking, emotional moment, but once you step back and look at the larger timeline, it creates a paradox that the movies never even attempt to explain. Mystique had been established as a major player in the future of the franchise long before Dark Phoenix. In the original trilogy, X-Men, X2, and X-Men The Last Stand, she's live, active, and deeply involved in Magneto's war against humanity. Those films are set decades after the prequel era, meaning Mystique's survival is baked into the original continuity. For years, that was just an accepted fact of the franchise's timeline. Then X-Men Days of Future Past complicated everything. Wolverine's time travel creates a branching timeline by preventing Mystique from assassinating Bolivar Trask. From that point onward, the movies clearly follow a new version of history, one where events can diverge from the original trilogy. That idea works in theory, and it even explains why certain characters' fates and personalities shift in later films. The problem is that Dark Phoenix doesn't fully commit to the rules that Days of Future Past sets up. In Dark Phoenix, Mystique dies in the early 90s during Jean Grey's breakdown. If this is truly the same post-Days of Future Past timeline, then Mystique cannot possibly appear in the present-day era seen in the original trilogy. Her death decades earlier should erase her role in Magneto's Brotherhood, undermine major plot points in the first three films, and fundamentally reshape mutant-to-human relations. Yet the franchise still treats those older movies as part of the same overall canon, creating a contradiction that never gets resolved. The paradox gets worse the more you think about it. If Mystique's death changes the future so drastically, then the future of Wolverine came from in Days of Future Past should never have existed in the first place, meaning he never would have gone back in time to change it. That's a classic time travel loop problem, and the movies offer no framework to deal with it.